All right. Today we are going straight into one of the most emotionally charged topics on the internet today, and I want to do it carefully, honestly, and with a clean standard of evidence. The question is simple on the surface. Did Jesus exist as a historical person? But the conversation gets messy because people constantly confuse two different questions. Question one: was there likely a historical figure behind the movement? Question two: did the miracles happen? Virgin birth, walking on water, resurrection, all that nice jazz. Those are not the same questions. And if you treat them like the same question, you'll confuse yourself and you'll confuse your followers, your subscribers, or whatever. So, here's what I'm going to do on this episode. First, I am going to explain what popular scholars and mainstream historians generally say about Jesus existing. Then I'm going to slow down and ask, what does the evidence actually show at a bare minimum, without overstatement? And we're going to keep a strict rule the entire time. The rule is going to be that evidence of belief is not the same thing as independent verification. So let me say that again, because it is the foundation of this whole episode today. Evidence that people believe something is not automatically proof that the thing actually happened. That's a better way for me to put it. If you're religious, you should want that distinction too, because truth does not need shortcuts. And if you're skeptical or atheist or whatever, you should want that distinction as well, because skepticism, atheism, or whatever is not about hating people. It is about not letting emotional commitments replace evidence. So, if you came here expecting me to have some propaganda about the thumbnail, then you're in the wrong place. This is going to be clean, historical, and I will have evidence that I will like to break down. I am going to be fair enough that both believers and skeptics can recognize themselves in today's episode. With that being said, hello, I'm CJ Everson, and welcome to The Jewish Skeptic. Now, before I name a single scholar, I need to establish the standard. When people ask, is there proof Jesus existed? They are imagining proof like we use in a courtroom or a lab. But that is not how ancient history works. We know this. I said this on a previous episode. Ancient history almost never gives you proof of the way modern people mean it today. It gives you probabilities, theses, and best explanations based on sources that are incomplete, biased, and separated from the events by time. Simple. So, the honest historian usually speaks in terms like, is this likely? Is this plausible? Is this contested? This is more probable than the alternative. Now, here's the problem with that. Most religious debates do not operate like history. They operate more like sales pitches, and no one knows sales better, right? Your sales guy. You will hear someone usually say, scholars agree that Jesus existed, and then they jump immediately to, therefore, Christianity is true. And that does not follow with me. That's like saying, scholars agree a man named Muhammad existed, therefore, Islam is true. No, that ain't true. Or scholars agree that Joseph Smith existed, therefore, Mormonism is true. A person existing does not validate the supernatural claims attached to him, y'all. So, the first standard I want everyone to adopt is this. If you want to talk about miracles, you need a higher bar of evidence than you need for basic historical existing claims. And just because a preacher existed does not violate physics. But a man walking on water does. An apocalyptic teacher existed does not violate biology. But a virgin gave birth, it does. So the standards are different, and we're going to keep them different in today's episode. Now, here is the second standard people confuse. Even in history, there is a difference between a source reporting what people believed versus a source independently confirming what happened. I'll give you an example. If I have a Roman historian saying there is a group of people called Christians, that is evidence that Christians existed. That's not evidence that their miracles happened. You guys get what I'm saying? Another example. If I have a Jewish historian saying people called a man Christ, that is evidence that someone used on that label, but it's not evidence the label is true. That makes sense? I'm saying that because I see today on the internet, this is where a lot of Christian apologetics, they quietly cheat in these debates. They treat belief reports as verification, and they act like questioning that is some type of moral failure. No, that's not any type of moral failure at all. It's just the way history works, man. So today, I'll be doing two things at once. I'm going to try to juggle these. I will tell you what mainstream scholarship often concludes and why. And I will also tell you what the evidence strictly demonstrates at least a bare minimum without sliding into any Jewish or Christian theology. I feel like that distinction will protect you from being manipulated from anyone else in the future. Now, with that being said, let's talk about what popular scholars commonly say about Jesus being a real historical figure. If you walk into any mainstream New Testament scholarship or ancient history departments, you will usually hear some version of something kind of like this. Jesus likely existed as a first century Jewish preacher or teacher or rabbi. But the Gospels are not neutral biographies. They are theological narratives. That is the basic two-part mainstream posture. And this is what jacked me up too, guys, so listen closely. In other words, One historical core is likely, but the stories have been shaped and expanded and mythologized and they had their own spin put on them. Now, I want you to be careful with that word consensus. A consensus is not a magic spell, and a consensus does not equal proof. And quite frankly, consensus can be wrong, but a consensus does mean something. It means that within the professional guide, most specialists think a certain explanation fits the available data better than the alternatives. That does not settle the issue for you personally, though. It tells you where the weight currently sits. Now, why do many scholars lean towards history or historicity? Usually for reasons like these, at least in my opinion. They think it is easier to explain the existence and growth of early Christianity if it started with a real person who was then interpreted and mythologized over time. They also often point to a crucifixion as a major anchor point. A crucified Messiah is a different concept in Jewish expectation. So some scholars see it as less likely to be invented wholesale and more likely to be reinterpretation of something that happened. And yes, scholars argue about how solid these arguments are, but that is the general mainstream picture. A real figure is probable. The miracle claims are not historically demonstrable. Now, here's a key point for this episode, so make sure you guys pay attention to this. Even if the mainstream conclusion of Jesus is correct, it does not give you what many believers act like it gives them. It does not give you a virgin birth. It does not give you walking on water. It does not give you resurrections. And it doesn't give you the Bible is true. It gives you something much more modest, in my opinion, that a movement likely emerged around a real person. So if your goal is to challenge overconfident religious claims, it seems like I do sometimes, you don't even need to deny that Jesus existed. You could just say something more accurate. Like, even if a historical Jesus existed, your leap of existence to divinity is not supported by the kind of evidence that you're implying. Now, to do this, honestly, we have to talk about the sources. What are the earliest sources? How close are they to the events? Are they independent? So, let's do that now. When people talk about evidence for Jesus, they often speak as if the Gospels are eyewitness diaries written by the disciples. That is not how critical scholarship typically frames it. The Gospels are later narrative works written in Greek and developed theological communities, and they do not present themselves like modern biographies do. I mean, would you guys agree with that? Think about it. And then I got another question for you. Now, what are the earliest Christian writers we have? For people who follow me, you should know this. We talked about it in previous episodes. Most historians and scholars will tell you the earliest writings we have is from Paul's letters. Paul's authentic letters are genuinely dated earlier than the Gospels. That matters because it tells you something about what the earliest believers were emphasizing and what they believed. But it also creates a huge issue for modern apologetics. And I'll tell you why. Because Paul is not writing like a journalist documenting Jesus' life. Paul is writing like a missionary theologian, interpreting Jesus as like a cosmic event. Paul does not give a clean biography. Paul doesn't walk through Jesus' parables in Galilee in a narrative way. Paul's Jesus is often presented through theology, scripture, interpretation, revelation, and community conflict. Now, to be fair, Paul does reference certain things. He references Jesus being crucified, and Paul references that Jesus had disciples. And Paul references a tradition about appearances. But Paul is still an inside source. He's an insider, y'all. And that is important because insider sources can contain history, but they are not independent verification. They are participants. Makes sense? Now, after Paul, you have the Gospels. And here's the thing. The Gospels preserve earlier traditions, but they are not early in the way people imagine they are. They are written after belief has already formed, after theology has developed, and after communities are already using scripture to interpret events. Now, that means that they are evidence, yes, but evidence of what? It's more like evidence that they're what Christians actually believed by the time the Gospels were written. I had to put that together, y'all. They are evidence of how stories were told in Christian communities. It's evidence of how theological agendas and competing community needs. And historians can sometimes extract historical signals from sources. But if you have to do it, you got to do it carefully when you do it. This is why serious scholarship uses methods like criticism and redaction criticism to separate earlier layers from later edit shaping. That's a way for me to put it. Now, if you're listening closely, you'll hear my theme again. Christian sources are evidence of Christian belief. I hope you guys get that. They may contain historical memory, but they are not neutral. So, the next move many Christian apologists make is this. They say, okay, fine, forget the Bible. Just forget the Bible. We have extra biblical evidence outside of Christian sources. So, yeah, let's talk about those carefully. It's going to get good. So when someone says there's tons of evidence outside the Bible, what they usually mean is a short list. Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, sometimes a reference to the Talmud. Now, I'm going to focus on the big two that people argue about the most, which is Tacitus and Josephus. So we know that Tacitus was a Roman historian, and in his work, the Annals, he discussed Nero and the Christians actually. And Tacitus mentions a figure called Christos, who was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Now, in mainstream scholarship, Tacitus is often treated as a strong non-Christian reference. Many scholars think the passage is authentic, meaning it is genuinely from Tacitus and not a later Christian insertion. But here's the critical distinction that we must not skip, and this is what I found out recently. Even if Tacitus is authentic, Tacitus is writing later, decades later at that. Describing is more like who the Christians were and their origin. Tacitus does not tell us where he got the information. So historians debate, did Tacitus consult official records? Did he consult Roman archives? Or was he repeating what was commonly known from the early Christian movement itself? And even if he did consult records, what does that prove? Well, at best, it supports that there was a movement called Christians. They were linked to a founder or a founder figure called Christos. And there was a tradition that this figure was executed under Pontius Pilate. That is significant, but it still is not the same thing as independent confirmation of a defined or detailed gospel biography. It does not confirm Bethlehem. It does not confirm the virgin birth. It does not confirm walking on water. It does not confirm the resurrection. It confirms that Romans knew about Christians and what Christians said about their origins. That is evidence of belief and possibly evidence of an executed founder, but we cannot turn it into more than what it is, people. So Tacitus is useful, but the apologetic exaggeration is this. They treat Tacitus like a police report. He's not writing a police report. He's writing history with limited transparency about sources. So Tacitus, yeah, useful, but not a miracle verifier. Now, let's go to a heavier debate. The Jewish traitor Josephus. Josephus was a first century Jewish historian. I hope y'all know that. People cite Josephus because he is closer in time and because he is not a Christian. The most famous Josephus passage is called the Testimonium Flavium, found in the Antiquities. Here is the problem. Many scholars think that the passage we have has been edited by later Christian hands because it contains lines that sound too Christian, like calling Jesus the Christ in a straightforward way. So, what is the mainstream media position? A very common view is Josephus likely said something about Jesus, but the passage has been altered in transmission. Some scholars argue for more authenticity, some for less, and some argue for even total fabrication. But the mainstream posture is often partially authentic with Christian interpolation. Now, why does this matter? Because again, what Josephus actually prove? What does Josephus actually prove, y'all? Even if Josephus wrote a core reference, Josephus is still reporting that there was a man called Jesus. Some people believed he was the Messiah. He was executed, and a moment continued. Well, not even a moment. It was more like a movement. Let me take that back. And so it was a movement continued from people believing that there was a man named Jesus, and they believed that he was a Messiah. So that is still not proof of supernatural claims. That is still not proof of a virgin birth or resurrection. It is evidence that claims existed early enough to be discussed by historians. Now, Josephus actually has a second famous reference, often called the James passage, where Josephus mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who was also called Christ. They try to shake with this one, but here we go. This passage is widely treated by many scholars and historians as authentic. Now it does. But there is a debate here too, because mystics and their writers and some critics argue about whether the phrase "who was called Christ" could have been added. So I want to be honest. There is an ongoing debate, even if a majority view exists. Now, here's the key point that helps us on this episode. Even if Josephus authenticates that there was a Jesus associated with a movement, Josephus still does not prove the Jesus of Sunday school, people. Josephus still does not confirm miracles. Josephus still does not confirm divinity. Josephus still does not confirm resurrection. Josephus, like Tacitus, at best helps confirm that a movement existed and that it is tied to a founder figure whose followers called him Christ. That's it. And this brings me to the biggest philosophical lesson of this entire episode and discussion today. The existence of sources that we talk about Jesus is not the same thing as independent verification of Jesus' biography. These sources can justify the conclusion that Christians existed and they had beliefs. They can support the probability of a historical founder, but they do not deliver the certainty that religious propaganda claims. If someone says Tacitus proves Jesus, your response can be no. Tacitus is evidence that the Romans knew Christians existed and that they believed about their founder. That is not the same thing as confirming miracles. And if someone asks or says, does Josephus proves the resurrection? Your response can be no. Josephus at best reports a movement and its claims, that it is not the same as verification of these claims. Now, I know some people listening are going to ask, so are you saying Jesus did not exist? Well, not yet. We ain't going to do no slogans, but we're slowly going to do an analysis. So now we get to the heart of the episode. Belief reports versus independent verification. Now, I want to slow this down because this is where people tend to get manipulated. A belief report is when a source tells you what people believed. Example, Christians believe Jesus was raised. Some Jews believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Christians say Christos was executed by Pilate. All of those are belief reports. Now, belief reports are not worthless. They are incredible. They're incredibly valuable. I mean, they're huge. They tell us what ideas existed in a given place and time. They tell us how communities form. They tell us what people are willing to die for and at least claim they are willing to die for. But belief reports are not the same as independent confirmation that the belief is true. Independent verification is when a source, especially one outside of the movement, confirms a detail in a way that is not dependent on the movement's own claims. And in ancient history, that is hard to get. So, what do we have for Jesus? We have Christian sources that claim a lot. We have non-Christian sources that reference the movement and its founder claims. But what we don't have of contemporary neutral administrative documentation that modern people imagine. We don't have that, people. So the honest conclusion is there is not no evidence. So it's just honest to say there is no evidence. Tend to just say, oh, that there's not any. You know how people get. So the honest conclusion is the evidence is primarily belief based. It is movement based and is tradition based with some external references that likely reflect what was being claimed. This is very different than we have proof. That's what I was trying to get you guys to understand. What I just said. So, if all the evidence comes from insiders, then the evidence mainly shows what insiders believe. If outsiders later mention the movement, that shows the movement existed and it had claims. Neither of these automatically proves the miracle claims of Jesus, though. So, you are not required to argue Jesus definitely did not exist. You can argue even if a historical figure existed, the evidence does not justify your confidence about supernatural claims. Now, I don't want this episode to become one-sided. So next I'm going to steelman the best case for the historical Jesus, because if you can't stop the opposing argument clearly, you do not understand it. I hope that makes sense to y'all. Now, here is the strongest case many historians would give for historicity without preaching. First, movements often start with people. It is historically common for new religious movements to form around charismatic teachers. Second, the crucifixion. A crucified Messiah is not the cleanest selling point in Jewish expectation. So some scholars argue it is more likely that something happened, an execution maybe, and the movement reinterpreted it than that someone invented a Messiah who failed in a public way. Third, multiple streams. Even if the Gospels are not independent eyewitness diaries, scholars often argue that they contain different traditions and that Paul represents another stream. So, if you have multiple streams pointing toward an executed founder, some scholars take that as a historical core. Fourth, simplest explanation. In my opinion, it's the most simplest explanation. Some scholars argue that the simplest explanation for why there were Christians in the mid-first century is that there was a real founder figure, later interpreted as divine. And I want to be fair, and that is a reasonable historical argument. Now notice what I just did. None of that proved miracles. None of that proved divinity. It argued probability of an underlying person. This is why many scholars can say Jesus probably existed, while also saying the Gospels are not strictly historical records. Now, let me show you how to be fair and still be skeptical at the same time, because the skeptical argument is not stupid. It has real valid points. Here is the skeptical case, stated cleanly without conspiracy language. 1. The sources are late. The Christian sources are written by believers, for believers, to persuade. That doesn't make them useless, but it does mean that they are not neutral. I hope you guys understand that. 2. The non-Christian sources are not contemporary confirmations. Tacitus is later and does not cite his source. Nowhere at all does he cite a source. Josephus is contested in at least one major passage and debated in the others. So the outsider sources are not a clean case closed, if you guys know what I mean. 3. The evidence strongly supports a movement, not a verified biography. Even if we accept that Jesus existed, the evidence does not justify the modern certainty with which people speak about specific gospel scenes. When someone says, we know Jesus said this exact sentence, that is usually not something history can guarantee. 4. The theological application problem. Religious communities are not meaning machines. They interpret events. They reshape stories for teaching. They attach prophecy readings. They build narratives that function as identity and control people. So from a philosophical and anthropology lens, the existence and grand claims does not surprise us. It is what humans do. And that's what leads to your strongest minimal conclusion. At minimum, the evidence justifies that by the mid-first century, groups existed who believed in a messianic figure associated with execution and exoneration, and they formed communities around that belief. That is a solid, careful claim. What it does not justify is this. Therefore, the resurrection happened. Therefore, Christianity is true. Therefore, you must obey. It doesn't verify that. Now, some people will push beyond skepticism and into mythicism, the claim that Jesus didn't exist at all. And we got to address that too, because if I ignore it, people will accuse me of hiding it. So I got to bring it up too. So let's handle it like adults. There is a position often called mysticism, which argues that Jesus is largely and entirely a mythical construction, and that there may not have been a historical founder in a normal sense. Now, here is the honest landscape. Mysticism exists in public discourse and online discourse, and some academics argue for it. But it is generally considered a minority position in mainstream scholarship. That doesn't automatically mean it is false. It just means it doesn't carry the same professional consensus weight as history. I'm gonna start choking again. Now, I want to make an important point here that helps this channel stay clean. You don't have to adopt mysticism to defeat the apologetic game, because the biggest apologetic overreach is not Jesus existed. The biggest apocalyptic overreach is because Jesus existed, the miracles are proven and you must obey. That's the leap. So you can say something more like this when you're having this discussion with an apologetic. I understand why most scholars think a historical preacher is the simplest explanation. But even if it is true, that is not proof of supernatural claims, and it is not proof of a divine authority. That stance is historically literate and logically tight, and it avoids the trap of overstating your own certainty. Now, because you asked for popular scholars, I'm going to mention one figure people argue about. Bart Ehrman. And I love Bart Ehrman. Not gonna lie, he helped me on a lot of New Testament stuff. Bart Ehrman argues strongly against mysticism and says it is extremely unpersuasive to most specialists, while also acknowledging that the historical Jesus is not identical to the gospel Jesus. That is a good illustration of how scholarship often works. Scholars can confirm a historical figure while rejecting theological conclusions. Now, let's bring this whole episode together into a tight, scriptical conclusion. So, guys, here is where we land. And I want to say this as clearly as possible. If you ask, what do many mainstream scholars think is probable? Many will say a historical Jesus likely existed. If you ask, What does the evidence strictly prove? At minimum, it proves that early communities existed that believed in a messianic figure and formed a movement around that belief. And that is a massive difference, because belief does not equal verification. And even if a historical founder existed, the evidence does not automatically give you virgin birth, walking on water, resurrection, or divinity, or moral right to control other people's lives. So here is the line I want you to remember. A claim being ancient does not make it true. It only makes it ancient. And here's the second line I want you to remember. Extraordinary claims that demand extraordinary life requires... No, I'm sorry. Extraordinary claims that demand extraordinary life changes require extraordinary evidence. That's like a little plus sign to what I usually say on my channel. Not fear, not threats, not no have faith, not trust me, bro. Evidence. And if that gets someone angry at you for having that standard, then it ain't even an argument from the get-go. That is pressure. And if you're a believer watching this, you might say, well, faith goes beyond evidence, and that's your right. But once you go beyond evidence, you have to stop pretending like you're in a category of knowledge. Call it faith if you want, but you can't call it proof. And if you're skeptical watching this, don't turn your skepticism into a new dogma. Be consistent, be honest. Admit what we can say with confidence and admit what we cannot. This is what truth seeking looks like. And that is the whole mission of this channel. No fear, no dogma, just clarity. See you guys on the next one. CJ Everson, and I am the Jewish Skeptic. So long.
Do you know what I found? The more you know, the less you know.